Simpsons fans think the show just got lucky a few creepy coincidences after 30-plus years on TV, but look closer at the actual episodes, when they aired, and all the claims flying around online, and you'll see a totally different story. Here's everything nobody checked before calling The Simpsons psychic: the scale. You have seen the headline. It scrolls past on your phone during some strange week in the news. A war, a gadget, a famous name in trouble, and somewhere underneath it sits the same 5 words. The Simpsons predicted it again. There is a little jolt when you read it, a small, uneasy thrill. The feeling that a goofy yellow cartoon has somehow stayed one step ahead of the whole world for longer than some of the people sharing the headline have been alive. That feeling is what tonight is about. Where it comes from, what is real inside it, and what is not. To understand how the show built that reputation, you first have to understand how much of it there is. The Simpsons has been on the air since December 17, 1989. By the season that ran through 2025 and into 2026, it had aired somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 episodes, more than any other scripted show in the history of American primetime. No other cartoon comes close. No drama, no sitcom, nothing. It is the longest-running scripted series the country has ever produced, and as of this recording, it is still going, with new seasons already ordered. Sit with that number for a second, because it is the key to the whole mystery. 800 episodes is not a television show. It is a small civilization of jokes. Every one of those episodes is stuffed with background signs, throwaway lines, quick gags on the edge of the frame, futures imagined for a laugh and then forgotten by the next commercial break. Across more than 35 years, the show has tossed out tens of thousands of tiny guesses about how the world might go. Some were about money, some were about gadgets, some were about politics or disasters or famous people behaving badly. Most of them missed, the way most guesses do, and nobody remembers the misses. A handful, though, landed. And when a guess from 1995 or 1998 quietly comes true 20 years later, it stops feeling like a guess. It feels like a message. That is the engine underneath the entire legend, and it has a name that mathematicians have understood for a very long time. In 1989, the same year the show began, 2 statisticians named Frederick Mosteller and Percy Diaconis wrote about something they called the law of truly large numbers. The idea is simple enough for anyone to follow. If you give something enough chances to happen, even a wildly unlikely thing becomes almost certain to happen eventually. Flip a coin a few times, and nothing strange occurs. Flip it 10 million times, and you will find long, spooky streaks that look impossible, but are not. A show with 800 episodes is flipping that coin constantly, every week, for decades. Of course, some of the faces come up looking like prophecy. With that many guesses in the pile, a few bullseyes are not a miracle. They are arithmetic. Human beings are pattern-finding animals, and that is the other half of the engine. We see faces in clouds and shapes in television static, and meaning in pure noise. Because for most of history, a brain that spotted the tiger hiding in the grass survived, and a brain that shrugged it off did not. So when a cartoon from decades ago lines up with a headline from this morning, the oldest part of us sits up and insists that this cannot possibly be chance. Most of the time, chance is exactly what it is. The hits feel loud, and the thousands of quiet misses leave no trace, and our memory keeps only the score that flatters the legend. None of that makes the feeling any less real when it arrives. A coincidence you can explain calmly on paper will still raise the hair on your arms when you meet it out in the wild. That small gap between what we know and what we feel is the warm little room the whole legend has always lived inside. The people who actually make the show have said as much, plainly, and more than once. Al Jean, who has run the writer's room since the late 1990s, put it about as simply as it can be put. He has explained that the so-called predictions are mostly just educated guesses, and he passed along a line from one of his own writers that has become the truest thing anyone has said about the whole business. If you write hundreds of episodes and you fail to predict anything at all, then you are doing a pretty poor job. Throw enough darts at the board, and some of them are going to land in the center. That is not a magician talking. That is a man who knows exactly how the sausage gets made, and who has been answering this same question for most of his career. We pass these stories around for reasons that have little to do with the show itself. Sharing a spooky little pattern is a kind of social glue. It says, "Come and see this strange thing I noticed. Come and feel the chill with me." A prediction that came true is a tiny gift you can hand to anyone, a moment of shared wonder that costs nothing and asks nothing. The cartoon is almost beside the point. The real pleasure is in the passing along. Add the speed of the internet to that very old impulse, and the legend becomes almost impossible to stop. A screenshot travels in seconds. A correction, when it comes at all, arrives days later and reaches a fraction of the same eyes. So the striking version wins every time, simply because it moves faster than the dull and accurate one. The legend is not really built on what the show did. It is built on what spreads. So why does the legend keep swelling if the writers themselves keep waving it off? Part of the answer is that we want it to be true. There is something comforting about the idea that someone, even a cartoon, holds a map of where all of this is going. The world feels chaotic and frightening, and a show that seems to know the future becomes a strange little reassurance that the chaos has a shape. We reach for that. We always have, long before this show existed, in oracles and almanacs and fortune tellers. The Simpsons is simply the version that happens to repeat at 8 in the evening. And part of the answer is darker and much more modern. The legend has slowly stopped depending on the show at all. For years now, fake Simpsons predictions have spread faster and farther than the real ones. Doctored images and mislabeled clips passed around by millions of people who never stop to check. The myth has grown so large that it now feeds itself, manufacturing prophecies the show never made and attaching them to a face everyone already trusts. We will get to those fakes near the end. They turn out to be some of the most revealing entries in the whole catalog, because they show that the legend no longer needs the cartoon to keep growing. Consider how long that run really is when you measure it in ordinary lives instead of seasons. A child born in the same week the show first reached the air is now deep into adulthood, old enough to have children who themselves grew up with that yellow family on the screen. Whole careers have started and finished inside its run. Leaders have come and gone. Entire television networks have been launched, swallowed, and renamed, while the show simply kept making episodes, week after week, year after year. A series that survives that long stops competing with other shows. It begins competing with time itself, and time is the one force that can turn a stray little guess into something that looks like fate. News outlets worked out long ago that those few words pull a crowd like almost nothing else online. Now every strange turn in the world sets off the same quiet ritual. Somewhere, someone goes hunting back through old episodes, freezing frames, squinting at the signs in the background, searching for the moment the cartoon supposedly called it first. Sometimes they turn up a real one. More often they find something blurry enough to pass, and the headline writes itself before anyone bothers to check. That search has become its own small industry, running on the simple fact that we would all secretly love the answer to be yes. For now, hold on to the shape of the thing, because the shape is what lets you see clearly. There are really three kinds of Simpsons predictions, and almost everything you have ever heard about falls into one of them. There are the coincidences, the lucky darts, jokes about the present that the future simply happened to copy. There are the genuine ones, the small number of moments where the show truly did see something coming, usually because the people writing it were a great deal smarter than the cartoon ever let on. And there are the fakes, the inventions, the predictions that were never inside any episode at all. Tonight, we sort real from invented, one careful entry at a time, and by the end, you will be able to do the thing almost no headline ever bothers to do. You will be able to tell which is which. That honest answer, the one we are building toward, is going to surprise you in both directions. Some of the most famous predictions you have heard about are pure nonsense, never in the show, or so badly misread that the writers themselves wince at them. And one or two of the quiet ones, the entries that never trend, are stranger and more genuinely real than any headline ever managed to say. The legend has the loud ones backward and the true ones hidden, and straightening that out is the entire point of the next 9 chapters. So we begin not with the math, but with the moment the legend was truly born, the single prediction that turned a running internet joke into something people half believed. Before the year 2000, nobody said The Simpsons could see the future. After one particular episode came true 16 years later, everybody did. Pulling the real from the fake is not about spoiling the fun. Both things can be true at the same time. A show this enormous truly did land a few real hits worth marveling at, and the legend wrapped around those hits truly has been blown far past anything the show ever did. Holding both ideas at once is the only honest way through this. By the end of tonight, you will not believe less in the show. You will simply believe in the right parts of it. What the sheer scale of this legend demonstrates is that a show with hundreds of episodes and decades on the air was always going to land a few real hits by chance alone, long before any single one of them ever looked like magic. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. We start with the one that put the whole legend on the map. The prediction that a cartoon written in the year 2000 somehow named the next president of the United States. Section 2, the president. Picture a viewer on an ordinary night in the spring of 2000, half watching, a snack in hand, when the show throws its story forward into the far future. Lisa Simpson, all grown up, is sitting behind a desk as President of the United States. She wears a serious expression and an outfit built to read as important. She turns to the people around her and begins talking about money, about how tight the budget is, about the mess she has been handed by the person who held the office before her. And then she says the line that would take 16 years to detonate. She has inherited quite a budget crunch, she explains, from President Trump. That is the whole thing. A single sentence, dropped into a daydream about the future, gone in a few seconds. The episode is called Bart to the Future, and it aired on March 19, 2000, in the show's 11th season. It was written by Dan Greeny. At the time, nobody watching believed they had just seen the future. They believed they had seen a joke, and a fairly small one, tucked inside a story that was really about Bart and a vision of where his life might lead. Watch how carefully that joke is built, because the construction is the entire reason it worked. The line is thrown away on purpose. It is not a plot point, not a punchline the camera lingers on, not a moment the music swells beneath. Lisa mentions President Trump the way you might mention last month's weather, as old news, as a fact so settled it barely needs saying out loud. The animation does not wink at the audience. No character gasps or turns to the camera. The show treats a Trump presidency as something that has simply already happened and already been survived. A piece of background furniture in a story about something else. That flatness is the craft. A joke that is screamed is a joke you can argue with. A joke that is muttered, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, slips right past your defenses and waits there quietly for years. Underneath the gag sits something sharper than a lucky guess. In the year 2000, Donald Trump was a real and very public figure, openly flirting with politics, testing a run for president under a third-party banner, giving interviews about it, putting his name in the national conversation. The writers were not pulling a stranger out of thin air. They were watching a famous businessman dip a toe into national politics, and then following that idea forward to what felt, to them, like its bleakest logical endpoint. Greene later explained that the line was meant as a warning, not a forecast. A Trump presidency struck him as the last stop on a road the country already seemed to be traveling. The kind of thing that would happen if America kept sliding in the direction it was already sliding. The joke was never really about the future. It was about the present, pushed one step further than anyone in the room wanted to look. Think about the choice to make Lisa the one who inherits the mess. Of everyone in that family, she is the careful one, the smart one, the child who actually reads and worries and tries to do the right thing. Putting her behind the desk and handing her a broken budget is its own quiet argument. The grown-ups in the room, the show seems to say, will leave the bill for the responsible kids to pay. Trump is named as the person who ran things just before her, the figure standing for the moment everything tipped over. As a piece of comic shorthand, it is doing a great deal of work in very few words. Consider also the flatness of how it is delivered. There is no sting in the music, no reaction shot, no pause to let the audience gasp. The line is dropped and the scene keeps moving, the same way a real person mentions a bill that is already overdue. That refusal to underline the joke is exactly what let it survive the trip across 16 years. A punchline that begs you to notice it ages badly. A punchline that barely seems to notice itself can sit in a drawer for a decade and a half and lose none of its edge. Back in the spring of 2000, the joke landed softly and then was gone. People watching at home, if they laughed at all, laughed at the sheer silliness of imagining that particular celebrity ever running the country. Nobody rewound the tape. Nobody wrote it down. It was one small absurd flourish in a busy half hour of television, no heavier than 100 other gags the show had made that same season. The weight it carries now was poured into it later, by history, drop by drop. The way this one small moment lives in the world now is almost hard to believe. For 16 years it sat in the archive, unremarkable, one throwaway line among many thousands. Then, on the night of November 8, 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States, and that buried sentence came roaring back to life. Clips of Lisa at her desk spread across the internet within hours, shared by people who could not quite believe what they were seeing. The show itself answered soon after with one of its famous chalkboard gags, the opening bit where Bart writes a line again and again, and this time the line read that being right sucks. The episode did not just become a piece of trivia that week. It became the founding document of the entire Simpsons predicted it legend. The first thing every news roundup now reaches for. The single prediction that made ordinary people start to wonder whether the cartoon could actually see. Notice why that particular name worked so well as a punchline in the first place. In the year 2000, the joke depended entirely on the idea being ridiculous. A famous television personality and businessman somehow running the whole country. The humor lived in the distance between the man and the office. The writers were not betting it would happen. They were borrowing a face the whole audience already found larger than life, and using it as shorthand for things having gone completely off the rails. Satire mostly works by taking something that already exists and stretching it one size too far. The show did not invent a future from nothing. It looked at a real figure already circling real politics and simply asked what the most absurd version of that road might look like. When the absurd version arrived for real, it felt like foresight. It was closer to a careful reading of a man who was already telling everyone, loudly, exactly who he was. There is one more piece to this, and it matters, because it shows how the legend bends a story even when the story is already strange enough on its own. After 2016, a set of images spread everywhere, showing an animated Trump riding down a golden escalator exactly as he had done in real life when he announced his campaign. The cartoon supposedly nailing even that tiny detail. Those images are real animation. But they are not from the year 2000 episode. They come from a short the show released in 2015 called Trump-tastic Voyage, made after Trump had already ridden that real escalator into the news. The show was not predicting the escalator. It was joking about something that had just happened a few weeks earlier. The fact fact-checking site Snopes laid this out clearly. People had stitched a genuine old prediction together with a brand new joke and waved the whole bundle around as a single seamless miracle. That blurring is the thing to hold on to, because you will see it again and again tonight. The Simpsons really did write the words President Trump into a script in the year 2000, 16 full years early, and that is genuinely eerie on its own. But the legend could not leave it alone. It had to make the prophecy bigger, cleaner, and more total than it really was, until a sharp piece of political satire got dressed up as full-blown magic. The real story and the inflated story arrived in the same breath, tangled together so tightly that most people never bothered to pull them apart, and most still have not. For years after it aired, the line stayed almost completely invisible. A few fans remembered it. A stray message board post would surface it now and then as a curiosity, but it was nobody's idea of a famous moment, just one more odd corner of a show with endless odd corners. Then, the night of the 2016 election arrived, the result came in, and within hours the clip was everywhere, leaping from feed to feed faster than anyone could fact-check it. A throwaway from a children's cartoon had become, overnight, the most shared piece of supposed prophecy on the internet. Greenie and the rest of the team suddenly found themselves answering for a joke most of them had half-forgotten writing. The show responded the only way it knew how, by joking back, putting Bart at the chalkboard to write that being right feels terrible. There was a weariness in that gag, a sense of a show that never wanted this particular crown and could not put it down. The prediction it was most famous for was one it had meant as a grim little warning, and the warning had failed. The quiet truth at the center of it is the saddest part, and the most human. A worried writer in the year 2000, looking hard at his own country, reached for the most absurd future he could picture, as a way of sounding a small alarm. He chose the punchline that felt most like hitting rock bottom, the joke that meant things had gone as wrong as he could imagine, and then he watched, 16 years later, as the country walked straight into the joke he had meant as a warning. He did not get to feel clever about it. The chalkboard said it for him, line after line after line. Being right, it turned out, did not feel like winning anything at all. Strange as it feels, the chill and the explanation can sit comfortably side by side. A warning can be sharp enough to come true and still be nothing more than a warning. The cartoon did not see this one man coming down the years. It saw the kind of country that might one day reach for him, and it said so out loud, long before most of us were ready to hear it. What the Trump line demonstrates about the show's so-called predictions is that the eeriest of them are usually sharp satire aimed straight at the present, a warning that only started to look like prophecy once the warning quietly came true. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. If naming a future president felt like a fluke, the next one is harder to wave away. The show seemed to call a corporate takeover worth tens of billions of dollars more than 20 years before the deal was ever signed. Section 3, the merger. This one you could miss 100 times and never catch. It is not a line of dialogue, it is a sign. In an episode from late 1998, the camera drifts past the gates of the film studio that makes the show, the famous one with the searchlights and the grand old name, and on the sign, in small letters tucked underneath the studio name, sit a few extra words. They tell anyone who happens to be paying attention that this proud, century-old studio is now a division of the Walt Disney Company. The episode is called When You Dish Upon a Star. It aired on November 8, 1998, in the show's 10th season, written by Richard Apple. The gag is buried in the background, the kind of joke the animators slip in for the handful of viewers who freeze the frame and read the small print. In 1998, the idea was pure absurdity. The studio that aired The Simpsons was one of the great independent powers in Hollywood, a direct rival to Disney, not a piece of it. The sign was a joke about corporate greed, about how every studio seemed to be swallowing every other studio, drawn out to its silliest possible conclusion. Disney owning everything was the punchline precisely because, at the time, it sounded ridiculous. Study how the joke is staged, because the staging is what let it age into prophecy. The show did not put the idea into a character's mouth. Nobody says the words "Disney owns us now." There is no scene about it, no argument, no plot thread, no dialogue at all. The joke is set dressing, painted onto a sign in the background and left there for you to notice or not notice. That choice is exactly what allowed it to survive. A spoken joke from 1998 would have felt dated within a year or two, tied to whatever was in the news that month. A sign, glimpsed for half a second and gone, simply sat in the archive, quietly waiting to be right. And there was a private bite to it that almost nobody outside the building would have felt at the time. This was a show made at that very studio, joking, on its own network, about being devoured by Disney one day. The writers were teasing the hand that fed them, gently, on a sign most people would never bother to read. Run the frame back and study what is actually on the screen. The shot is an ordinary establishing view, the kind a show uses to say here is where we are now. The studio gates, the searchlights sweeping the sky, the famous name spelled out in big confident letters. Under that name, in lettering small enough to miss at normal speed, sits the joke. You are not meant to catch it live. You are meant to catch it, if at all, on the second or or third time through, the moment your eye finally drifts to the bottom of the sign. Hiding a joke in the set dressing is its own particular craft, and it depends on a kind of viewer who did not really exist yet in 1998. It depends on people who pause, who rewind, who own the episode and study it frame by frame looking for buried treasure. A spoken line belongs to the moment it is said and then it is gone. A sign painted into the background belongs to anyone patient enough to stop and read it, which means it can keep paying off for as long as the show exists. The writers were planting something for a future audience with a pause button, and the joke carried a second edge that only the people inside the building would have felt at the time. This was a program made and aired by that very studio, using its own airtime to picture the day a larger company would own it outright. There is a particular nerve it takes to make that joke on your own employer's network, even gently, even buried in small print. The room was laughing at its own bosses, and trusting that those bosses either would not notice or would be good sports about it. What the joke truly understood was the logic of an entire industry, and that is a far stranger talent than seeing the future. The people writing the show were not gazing into a crystal ball. They were watching the business they worked inside, from a desk in the middle of it. They had just watched Disney buy the broadcast network ABC and the sports giant ESPN in the middle of the 1990s. They could see which way the whole industry was tipping, toward bigger and bigger companies eating smaller ones until only a few giants remained standing. So they took that trend and pushed it to its most extreme endpoint, Disney owning even its largest rival, and they painted it onto a sign as a joke. The gag was never a guess about one specific contract. It was a clear-eyed reading of where every arrow in the business was already pointing. Everyone in television could feel the ground shifting through those years. Smaller studios were vanishing into bigger ones. Names that had stood on their own for generations were quietly becoming brands inside someone else's empire. You did not need a crystal ball to sense where it was heading. You only needed to be paying attention from inside the business, watching the giants grow hungrier season after season, and willing to follow that hunger to its natural end. So a joke that began as pure exaggeration slowly stopped being exaggeration at all. The gap between the silly version on the sign and the real shape of the industry narrowed a little every year, until one day there was almost no gap left. What had been a wild punchline in 1998 had become, without anyone quite noticing, a fair description of the road the whole business was already walking down. And then, slowly, the arrows arrived exactly where the show had aimed them. In December 2017, Disney announced that it would buy most of its great rival, the sprawling entertainment company that owned the film studio and the television operation. The deal closed in the early hours of March 20th, 2019, and was reported to be worth in the neighborhood of $71 billion. The grand old studio, a rival to Disney for the better part of 100 years, became a division of Disney in plain legal fact, exactly as the cartoon had painted it 21 years earlier. When the news broke, that buried 1998 sign came flying back out of the archive and spread everywhere as the proof that finally crowned the legend. After the throwaway joke about a future president, this felt like something else entirely. This felt like the cartoon had read a contract that did not yet exist. The man who runs the writer's room played it down, the way he always does with these. Al Jean pointed out that the gag had simply been a joke about companies gobbling each other up, the kind of thing the show did constantly, and that the world had caught up to the joke rather than the joke seeing into the world. He was right, of course. But being right did not make the moment any less strange to live through for the people it happened to. By the middle of the 2010s, the pattern the writers had spotted was no longer a quiet trend. It had become the open shape of the whole business, a handful of enormous companies steadily absorbing everything smaller than themselves until only a few real giants were left standing. The cartoon had simply drawn the finish line of that race years before the runners arrived. What had looked like an absurd exaggeration in 1998 now read like a sober forecast, because the world had spent 2 decades catching up to the punchline. When the real deal was finally announced, the disbelief was most of the story. People who had grown up on the show dug the old frame back out, set it beside the news, and could hardly believe the match. The image went everywhere all over again, not as a joke this time, but as evidence, the kind of thing passed around with a single stunned line of caption. A buried background gag had been promoted, by events alone, into one of the crown jewels of the entire prediction legend. Across the internet, the reaction was not really about media business at all. It was about the eerie feeling that the cartoon had known. Few of the people sharing it cared about the details of who bought whom, or for how much. They cared that a silly sign from their childhood had turned out to describe the real world, and that feeling, that small shiver of the uncanny, is the fuel the legend runs on. A corporate filing had been turned, by sheer coincidence of timing, into something that felt almost like magic. Think about what actually occurred here, slowly, because the human shape of it is easy to lose inside all the corporate language. A handful of writers in 1998 made a small throwaway joke about their own studio being swallowed by a bigger company. It was a joke about their own future, their own bosses, their own building, their own paychecks. They wrote it for a laugh and went home. And then, more than than 2 decades later, the people who happened to be making the show that very morning woke up to discover that the old joke had quietly come true all around them. They were now, in actual legal fact, employees of the very company their predecessors had laughed about over a background sign. The punchline had become the name on their payroll. A studio that had stood as its own independent kingdom since the earliest days of film had become a division of someone else, exactly as one painted sign had whispered it would, back when the whisper was meant to be absurd. The headlines always skip the least magical part of the whole story, which is plain attention. Nobody on the show needed a window into the future. They needed only to watch their own industry honestly and follow it where it was so clearly going. That is a rarer gift than fortune-telling, and a far more useful one. Anyone can throw out a guess. Very few people can look hard at the present and refuse to flinch from where it leads. The show's real talent was never prophecy. It was the simple, unglamorous nerve to keep its eyes open while almost everyone around it looked away. What the Disney sign demonstrates about the prediction legend is that the show was reading the plain logic of an industry it lived inside, extending a trend already obvious to anyone paying close attention, which is a sharper and far stranger talent than any kind of fortune-telling. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Predicting a business deal is one kind of trick. Predicting the gadget strapped to your own wrist is another, and for that we travel to a wedding set in a future that has already quietly arrived. Section 4. The future on your wrist. Step into the year 2010, as the show imagined it back in 1995. Lisa Simpson is grown up and in love, engaged to a polished young Englishman named Hugh. At one point, Hugh lifts his arm, brings his wrist up close to his mouth, and speaks into it, talking into a small device worn like a watch, the way you and I now talk into the phones worn on our wrists. Elsewhere in that same imagined future, Lisa shares her engagement news over a screen that shows the living face of the person she is speaking to, a video call years before the world had a common word for one. The episode is called Lisa's Wedding, and it aired on March 19, 1995, in the show's 6th season. It was written by Greg Daniels, and the grown-up Hugh was voiced by the actor Mandy Patinkin. The episode is widely loved, often named among the show's finest half hours, and it won the Television Academy's Award for the best animated program of its year. It imagines Lisa 15 years down the road, and it sets that future in a very specific year, 2010, a year the real world would eventually walk straight into without anyone noticing the cartoon had gotten there first. Notice how lightly the future is drawn, because the lightness is the whole trick. The show does not make a grand production out of its gadgets. There are no flying cars, no robot butlers, no gleaming chrome cities in the sky. The wrist device and the video call are simply there, sitting in the background of an emotional story about a young woman and her heart, treated as ordinary, barely worth a second glance. Nobody in the scene marvels at the technology or explains how it works. They use it the way you use a thing you have owned your whole life. That offhandedness is exactly why it reads as prophecy now. The show was not trying to dazzle anyone with the future. It was trying to make the future feel lived in and mundane and already a little worn. So it tucked the gadgets into the corners of the frame like furniture. And furniture is the one part of any future that tends to come true. Stay inside that imagined future for a moment longer, because the details are gentle and strange. Lisa is older, poised, a little melancholy, moving through a world that looks mostly like ours with a few quiet upgrades. The picture phone she uses to share her news is treated as nothing special, just the way people talk now. Hugh raising his wrist to speak is given no more weight than a man checking the time. Nothing in the frame announces that this is the future. The future is simply the air the characters breathe, and that easy confidence is what makes it land. Watch how the animation refuses to show off. A flashier show would have pushed in close on the wrist device, held the shot, let the audience marvel. This one keeps its distance and lets the gadget stay in the corner of the frame, unimportant, half ignored by the very characters using it. That restraint is a real choice. By treating tomorrow's technology as too ordinary to point at, the show accidentally described exactly how new technology actually feels once it arrives, which is to say, almost immediately boring. Compare that to nearly every other vision of tomorrow from the same era, all chrome and flying cars and gleaming towers. Those bold futures look sillier with every passing year, because the real future almost never arrives with that kind of fanfare. It arrives quietly, in our pockets and on our wrists, and within a week we forget we ever lived without it. A modest future, drawn without excitement, had a far better chance of coming true than any shiny one, simply because it understood how change really settles into a life. The honest truth about these gadgets, though, is that they were never really predictions at all. They were old dreams, borrowed. People had been imagining talking into their wrists for a very long time before 1995. The comic strip detective Dick Tracy was speaking into a two-way wrist radio back in the 1940s, half a century earlier. Spies in films and secret agents in paperback novels had been doing it for decades after that. There was even a real wrist computer sold to the public in the 1970s, clunky and strange and ahead of its time. The show was was not inventing the idea of a wrist communicator. It was reaching for a piece of science fiction shorthand so familiar that any viewer in 1995 would instantly read it and think, ah, the future. When the smartwatch finally arrived in the real world around 2014, and when video calling became something ordinary families did every single day, it felt like the show had seen it all coming. What had really happened was gentler and slower than that. The show had reached for a very old dream of tomorrow, and the world had simply, finally, gotten around to building it. Picture the difference between predicting a thing and predicting a habit. Plenty of stories have guessed at future gadgets. Far fewer have guessed how those gadgets would actually sit in a life, half ignored, pulled out at the dinner table, glanced at, and put away. The show got the habit right, and the habit is the harder thing to see coming. A clever person can imagine a wrist device. It takes a stranger kind of insight to imagine that we would be a little bored by it. A true forecaster of technology has to get the mood right as much as the machine. The flying car futures failed not because cars cannot fly, but because they imagined we would be amazed forever. This episode quietly assumed the opposite, that tomorrow would feel as flat and familiar as today, and that assumption is exactly what came true. The gadgets were borrowed. The shrug we now give them was the real bullseye. Watching it now, you feel the years fold over on each other in a way that is hard to shake. A future imagined in 1995, set in a year that is itself long behind us, describing a daily life that has only just become ours. 3 different moments in time, stacked into one short scene, all of them somehow correct at once. There is a gentle vertigo in it, the sense of standing inside a guess that the world simply walked into and made real. There is a softer thing buried inside this episode, and it has nothing to do with gadgets at all. Lisa's wedding is, underneath the science fiction trimmings, a quiet and rather sad story about growing up and growing apart. Lisa meets a young man she loves, and over the course of the episode she slowly realizes that he does not understand her family, and that loving someone is not always the same as building a life with them. The technology was never the point of any of it. It was scenery, painted around a much older and more painful subject, the moment a young person discovers that the future will ask them to choose. That is almost certainly why the gadgets feel so accurate. The writers were not concentrating on the wrist phone or the video screen, so they drew those things honestly and carelessly, the way real future technology actually shows up. Not with a fanfare, but as the dull background hum of ordinary lives going on. Every time a new device arrives that does what that old cartoon showed, the scene gets dragged back into the daylight. People hold their phones up beside the screen. They marvel that a half hour from 1995 somehow showed them their own afternoon. Each fresh gadget launch becomes another excuse to crown the episode a prophet, even though the gadget was a borrowed dream, and the episode was only ever guessing in the gentlest possible way. Part of why it resonates is that the show got the feeling right, not only the object. It saw that we would not stand around amazed by our own miracles for very long. It saw that we would grumble at them, ignore them, take them for granted within days. The deepest prediction in the whole episode is not the device on the wrist at all. It is the bored, ordinary way the characters use it, which is precisely how we use ours. Audiences also hold on to this episode for reasons that have nothing to do with technology. People remember it as one of the most quietly moving stories the show ever told, a half hour that earned real tears from viewers who came only for the jokes. The gadgets were never why anyone loved it. They loved it for Lisa, for the ache of a young woman seeing a future she was not sure she wanted. And so the gadgets collect the headlines, while the heart of the thing is what actually keeps people coming back to it. The prophecy is a footnote. The feeling is the reason. That split between what made it famous and what made it last is the whole quiet lesson of this entry in the catalog. There is one more reason this scene refuses to fade from memory. It pairs the gentle comedy of a wrong guess about gadgets with the real ache of a young woman standing at a crossroads. The wrist phone makes you smile a little. Lisa's face, older and uncertain, makes you go quiet. Holding those two feelings together, the silly and the sad, is the exact trick the whole episode pulls off, and it is why people who first met it as children still reach for it on hard nights as adults. Few half hours of television have aged into something so much warmer than they began. What started as a daydream became, for a great many people, a keepsake, a small piece of television they keep returning to long after they have forgotten exactly why they first pressed play. So picture it one more time and let it sit. A grown woman in a future that has now come and gone speaks into a screen that shows a face, the most normal thing in the world to us, and a small marvel to anyone watching in 1995. A young man lifts his wrist to his mouth at a wedding that, in the story, would not arrive for 15 more years, and that, in our world, is now itself well over a decade in the past. There is a soft and strange nostalgia in watching it today, a future that the world quietly went ahead and built while nobody was bothering to check the cartoon's homework, sitting there in an episode that was only ever really about a girl on the edge of growing up, looking down a road she had not yet walked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Those were lucky guesses dressed up as prophecy, old dreams the world simply finished building. The next one was something else entirely. The next next one was real science, hidden on a chalkboard by a writer who actually knew the math. Section 5. The equation. Most of the predictions in this catalog are accidents, jokes the future happened to copy by chance. This one was done on purpose, and that single fact changes everything about how you should see it. In an episode from 1998, Homer Simpson gets it into his head that he is going to be an inventor, and at one point, he stands at a chalkboard, scribbling away. Behind him, written out in full, is a long and serious-looking mathematical equation, the kind of thing you would expect to find in a university physics lecture, not in a cartoon about a man whose great love is donuts. For almost every viewer, it was a simple sight gag, a quick joke about Homer pretending to be a genius, far beyond his ability. Hardly anyone tried to actually read what was on the board. The episode is called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, and it aired on September 20th, 1998, in the show's 10th season. Years later, people who knew real physics started to look closely at that chalkboard, freezing the frame and copying down what Homer had written. What they found was astonishing. One of the equations scrawled behind him was a rough attempt to calculate the mass of a particle that, in 1998, had never been found by anyone. A particle the world would not confirm even existed until 2012, 14 years after the episode aired. A particle called the Higgs boson. Let me explain why that name matters, because the science here is the whole story. The Higgs boson is one of the great prizes of modern physics, a tiny building block of the universe that helps explain why other things have mass at all. Scientists spent decades hunting for it, and finally pinned it down in 2012 using the largest and most expensive machine humanity has ever built, a ring buried underground that cost billions of dollars and took thousands of people to run. It was front-page news around the world, the answer to a question physicists had chased for most of a lifetime, and there it was, or something startlingly close to it, sketched onto a cartoon chalkboard 14 years before that giant machine confirmed the answer. The writer Simon Singh, who wrote an entire book about the hidden mathematics tucked into this show, pointed out that if you actually sit down and work through Homer's equation, you land on a number that is not far off from the real mass the Higgs particle turned out to have, a guess made well over a decade before anyone on Earth could check it. Another physicist, named David Kaplan, ran the calculation himself and found that Homer's chalkboard pointed toward a particle a good deal heavier than the one eventually measured, somewhere around 777 billion electron volts, against a real value much closer to 125. So it was not exact, but it was in the right neighborhood in the right units for the right kind of particle, scribbled behind a cartoon character 14 years early. For a joke on a chalkboard, that is an almost absurd level of accuracy. Picture the gag as it actually played in real time. Homer has decided he is a great inventor, and the show gives him the full montage, the wild hair, the manic energy, the chalkboard covered in scribbles meant to signal raw genius at work. For the audience, the equation behind him is just set dressing for a joke about a foolish man reaching far above himself. The humor is supposed to come from the gap between Homer and the serious mathematics. The idea that this particular man could never understand a word of it. Nobody is expected to read the board. The board is there to look impressive and a little absurd. Treating a real equation as a throwaway sight gag is a strange and confident thing to do. The show puts genuine physics on the wall and then spends not a single second explaining it, drawing attention to it, or rewarding you for noticing. There is no character who turns and says, "By the way, this is real." The whole point of the gesture is that it asks for nothing back. It is craft performed for its own sake, sophistication folded so deep inside a dumb joke that almost no one will ever find it. Almost nobody in 1998 could even pause a live broadcast and study a single frame. The tools to freeze the image, copy the equation, and check the math arrived for ordinary people only later. So the joke was very nearly a message in a bottle, written for an audience that did not quite exist yet, tossed into the future in the quiet hope that someday someone with the right eyes and the right pause button would fish it out. So how on earth does a piece of real particle physics end up on the wall of a cartoon about a yellow family? The answer is the real secret behind every genuine prediction in this catalog, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with magic. The people writing this show were not ordinary comedy writers who happened to draw an equation that looked impressive. The room was full of people with serious training in mathematics and the sciences, degrees from some of the hardest programs in the country. The man who put that equation on the board, a writer named David X. Cohen, had a real background in physics and computer science, and when he needed something to hang behind Homer, he did not invent a fake jumble of symbols to look clever. He reached out to a working astronomer for help and built a genuine piece of physics, on purpose, as a private joke for the tiny handful of viewers who might someday pause the tape and try to read the board. The room behind this show was unlike almost any other in television comedy. It was packed with people who had trained in mathematics and the hard sciences before they ever wrote a joke. The kind of minds that find a hidden equation genuinely funny on its own terms. That background shaped the humor in ways most viewers never saw. Where another show might fake the look of intelligence intelligence, this one could afford the real thing, because the real thing was simply sitting there in the writers, waiting for a place to go. Jokes like the chalkboard were the room amusing itself first, and the audience a distant second. The writers were entertaining each other, slipping in references and equations and puzzles that only their own kind would ever catch. That is a rare luxury in television, where almost everything is built to be understood instantly by as many people as possible. Here was a show wealthy enough in talent to make jokes for an audience of a few, and patient enough to wait years for that audience to arrive. Hold on the strangeness of that for a moment, because it is the most human thing in this whole catalog. A man with a real science education sat down to write jokes for a cartoon, and somewhere in the middle of an ordinary work week he decided, purely for his own quiet amusement, to encode a true and difficult piece of cutting-edge physics onto a chalkboard, knowing almost no one would ever notice it was there. He was not trying to predict anything. He was playing the way a brilliant mind plays, leaving a small gift in the corner of the frame for whatever clever stranger might find it years down the line. And then reality, 14 years later, walked up to that chalkboard and quietly confirmed the joke was right. That is not a lucky dart thrown at a board. That is a very smart room having fun, and the fun happening to be true. Word of the chalkboard spread slowly, the way real discoveries tend to. Over the years, people who knew physics began to notice it, write about it, and pass it around among themselves like a private wonder. The equation turned into a small celebrity in classrooms and lecture halls, the favorite proof that a silly cartoon had a serious brain hiding under the hood. What started as a joke for nobody became, in time, a famous example of how much intelligence the show quietly carried. For a certain kind of fan, this single frame settles the entire argument about whether the show was clever or merely lucky. Anyone can throw out a guess and hope it lands. Almost no one can fold a real and difficult piece of cutting-edge science into a children's cartoon and have it hold up against the universe years later. This was not a coin landing on its edge. It was a demonstration of exactly how much knowledge sat in that room. And there is something tender in how small the intended audience was. The writer who built it knew that the number of people who would ever notice was tiny, maybe a few hundred souls patient and educated enough to stop the tape and read along. He did it anyway, for them, and for the private pleasure of having done it. The most genuine prediction in the whole catalog began as a quiet gift, handed to almost no one. This is the entry that separates the genuine predictions from all the coincidences crowded around them, and it is why you cannot dismiss the whole legend as nonsense. The wrist phone was an old dream the world finished. The future president was a worried joke about the present. The studio sign was a clever reading of an industry, but the equation was deliberate. Someone who understood the science chose to slip real knowledge into a cartoon, and that knowledge held up, more or less, against the actual universe. When fans argue that the show was genuinely smart and not merely lucky, this is the example they reach for first, every time, because this is the one that proves the room could truly do the thing the legend gives it credit for, at least once, on purpose. No other entry in this whole catalog can make that claim. The rest were guesses, borrowed dreams, or warnings the world happened to match. Only here did someone sit down, on purpose, with real knowledge in hand, and hide a true piece of the universe inside a throwaway joke. That is why this one means so much to the people who defend the show. Strip away every coincidence in the legend, and this single frame still stands, completely untouched, the one stubborn piece of proof that survives every argument anyone has ever thrown at it. What Homer's chalkboard demonstrates about the genuine predictions is that the strongest of them were never luck at all, but deliberate craft, real science slipped quietly into a cartoon by people who knew exactly what they were writing and were perfectly content to wait 14 years for anyone to notice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the most famous prediction of all is not really a prediction at all. It is a single brochure in a single episode that a great many people still cannot quite bring themselves to see the same way. Section 6, the brochure. Freeze the picture on a travel brochure. In an episode from the autumn of 1997, the family plans a trip to New York, and at one point, a cheap bus tour pamphlet sits there on the screen for a moment. The kind of thing you would never give a second glance. The price is printed large, $9, a deliberately silly bargain. And rising right next to that number are the two towers of the World Trade Center, drawn as two tall, thin rectangles, simply because that was the New York skyline at the time. To an anxious eye looking back years later, the number beside those two towers can be read as a 9 and a pair of 1s. That is the whole image. A bus fare and a building, side by side, for less than a second. The episode is called The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, and it aired on September 21st, 1997, in the show's 9th season. The brochure is pure background, a small quick prop in a story about Homer trying to recover his car from a New York parking enforcement office. Nobody in the scene mentions the price or the towers. The pamphlet is there to make the city feel real, and to set up a joke about how strange and overwhelming New York can be for a visitor. For 4 years, almost nobody gave that little image a second thought. Picture the episode as it actually played in 1997. Homer drives the family to New York to recover his car, which has been towed to a plaza between the towers, and the whole story is a comedy about how huge and baffling the city feels to an outsider. The brochure is one tiny prop among dozens, a bit of color to make the trip feel real. It flashes by while the plot hurries on to the next joke. Not one viewer that night paused to study the price or the buildings printed beside it. A travel pamphlet like that exists only to set a scene, and the artists who make them work fast and think little of it. Someone needed a cheap-looking tourist flyer, picked a silly low price, and drew the skyline everyone would recognize. That is the entire creative thought behind it. Background props are meant to be glanced at and forgotten, never frozen and decoded. The whole craft of background art depends on you not looking too hard, which is exactly the opposite of what the internet would later do to this one. Then came the morning of September 11th, 2001, and the towers fell, and the world changed, in a way that needs no description here. In the months that followed, someone paused that old episode, looked hard at the brochure, and saw the number 9 sitting beside two shapes that resembled the number 11. The internet did the rest. A throwaway prop from 1997 was suddenly being passed around as proof that the cartoon had somehow known, 4 years early, the date of the worst attack the country had ever seen. Look closely at how that prop was actually built, because the construction explains everything, and the mystery dissolves the moment you understand it. A writer and producer from that era named Bill Oakley, who worked on the show through some of its most celebrated years, has explained the brochure plainly more than once. The price was $9 for a simple reason. It was meant to be a comically, absurdly cheap fare, the kind of too-good-to-be-true bargain that fit the joke about New York hustling tourists. And the towers were drawn beside it for the most obvious reason imaginable. They were the most famous part of the New York skyline, so the artist drew them the way anyone drawing New York in 1997 would have. The alignment that looks so eerie now was never planned by anyone. It was two unrelated design choices that happened to land next to each other. Consider how brief that moment really is on the screen. The brochure appears for roughly a second, a piece of scenery the camera does not linger on for even a full breath. At normal speed, with the story rushing forward, there is no chance to read a price, let alone study the shapes beside it. The only way to see the supposed prophecy at all is to stop the tape, hold the frame still, and stare, which is something nobody does while simply enjoying an episode. Nobody watching in 1997 had the means to freeze it anyway. The tools that let ordinary people pause a broadcast, capture a single frame, and pass it around arrived for most homes only later. So the coincidence was effectively invisible for years, sealed inside a frame no one could hold still long enough to misread. The meaning everyone now sees was not just absent from the artist's intentions, it was physically impossible for the audience to notice until the technology to freeze it caught up. The deeper thing this image teaches has nothing to do with the show at all. It is a lesson in how the human eye works. We are built to find patterns, and we are especially built to find them after the fact, once we already know what we are looking for. Before the attacks, not one person in the audience saw anything in that brochure but a cheap bus tour. After the attacks, with the date burned into everyone's memory, the same harmless image suddenly seemed to scream. Nothing in the drawing changed. What changed was us, and the terrible knowledge we now carried to it. We do this with almost everything, not only with cartoons. Human beings are forever connecting the dots after we already know what picture they are supposed to make. We see shapes in the stars and warnings in old songs and meaning in the small coincidences of our own lives, but nearly always in hindsight once the ending is already known. Give a person the answer first, and they will find the clue that seems to point to it every time. The clue was always there. The pointing is what we add. Run that same brochure past someone who had somehow never heard of the attacks, and they would see nothing at all. Just a cheap bus tour and a city skyline. A throwaway gag about a tourist trap. The dread we feel looking at it does not live in the drawing. It lives in us, in what we know now and cannot unknow, and we pour that knowledge back into an innocent old frame until it seems to glow with a meaning no one ever painted there. That is the trap at the center of nearly every famous prediction. The meaning was not placed in the frame by the animators. It was placed there later, by viewers who already knew the ending, and went hunting backward for a clue. A coincidence becomes a prophecy only once you stand on the far side of the event and look back through it. The brochure did not predict anything. It simply sat in an archive, unchanged, until history walked up and handed it a weight it was never drawn to carry. The people who made the show have always been deeply uncomfortable with this particular one, and you can understand why. Al Jean, who has guided the writing for most of the show's life, has called it an unsettling coincidence and nothing more. The kind of thing that makes him wince rather than smile. There is no pride in it for them, no clever craft to point to, no buried joke they were proud of. There is only the bad luck of having drawn an ordinary skyline 4 years before that skyline became the site of unimaginable loss. Strip away the hindsight and the brochure is almost touchingly ordinary. A cheap bus tour, a silly low price meant to make tourists laugh, and the most famous skyline in the world drawn behind it because that is what New York looked like. Read it with fresh eyes eyes, and there is nothing dark in it anywhere. Only a small joke about a city that loves to separate visitors from their money. All the menace we now feel was added later, from the outside, by people who already knew a story the cartoon could not have known. For a long time, the episode itself paid a quiet price for the coincidence. After the attacks, it was pulled from syndication, kept off the air out of simple respect, because so much of it takes place in and around the World Trade Center, with the towers standing tall in the background of scene after scene. An episode that had once been an ordinary, funny half-hour about a family visiting New York became something the show could not comfortably broadcast. It was not the brochure alone, it was the whole bright, innocent picture of those buildings, filmed in a cartoon world that did not yet know what was coming. Think about why this particular coincidence sits so badly with the people who made it, when the others get worn almost like badges. With most of these so-called predictions, the show can point to something it is proud of: a clever joke, a sharp reading of the world, a hidden bit of cleverness. Here there is nothing to be proud of at all. There is no craft to claim, no wit to celebrate, only an ordinary skyline drawn in good faith and the worst timing imaginable. That is a very different thing to be famous for, and the audience, for the most part, does not share that discomfort. People pass the image around with a small thrill, the pleasure of an eerie pattern, rarely pausing to think about how it must feel to the artists who drew a happy postcard of a city that was later wounded. There is a gap there, between the delight of the people sharing and the unease of the people who actually held the pencils. That gap is where this whole strange chapter of the legend lives. Sit for a moment with what that actually means, because it is heavier than a trivia headline lets on. There is a version of New York preserved in that episode, a version from 1997, where the towers are just part of the scenery, just the place Homer's car gets towed near, just the familiar shape of a city going about its day. The people who drew it were not making a statement. They were drawing a postcard, and that postcard, made in good faith and pure silliness, became impossible to see the same way, because the real city in the drawing suffered a wound the cartoon could never have meant to foretell. The brochure is famous, but the saddest thing in the episode is the ordinary skyline behind it, smiling and whole, with no idea at all of what the years just ahead of it would bring. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every hit in the catalog carries that kind of weight. Some are small, almost silly, a fish, a school lunch, a typo on a screen, and yet they kept quietly coming true anyway. Section 7. The small ones. Some of these predictions barely register as predictions at all. A whole cluster of them are tiny, almost goofy, the kind of throwaway jokes that would never make a headline on their own and yet keep turning up on the lists anyway. And looked at together, these small ones may explain the whole thing better than the famous ones do, because their secret is so easy to see once you know to look for it. Start with a fish. In an early episode from the autumn of 1990, two kids fishing in the river downstream from the Springfield nuclear plant pull up a strange catch: an orange fish with 3 eyes, and a passing reporter turns it into the story of the week. The fish gets a name, Blinky, and becomes a small local sensation and a political headache, a living symbol of the pollution leaking out of Mr. Burns and his power plant. The episode is called 2 Cars in Every Garage and 3 Eyes on Every Fish, and it aired on November 1st, 1990, in the show's 2nd season. Blinky is on screen only briefly, but that single image, a cheerful little fish with 1 eye too many, became one of the most recognizable jokes the show ever made. The way the joke is drawn is the reason it works so well. Blinky is cute. He is rounded and bright and harmless looking, the kind of design a child would smile at. And that gentleness is exactly what makes the satire bite. The show is talking about something genuinely dark, a company poisoning the water and a town too comfortable to stop it, and it delivers that message through an adorable cartoon fish presented on the local news. The horror is wrapped in something soft, which is how the best satire usually travels. You are laughing at the little fish before you fully register what the little fish is telling you about the people in charge. Watch the small theatrical beat the show gives the reveal. A line goes into the water, the catch comes up, and there it is, a bright orange fish blinking back with 1 eye more than it should have. The moment is staged like a local news segment, all mock seriousness and breathless concern, which is part of why it lands. By dressing a cartoon mutant in the costume of a real news story, the show makes its joke feel like something you might actually see at 6 o'clock. Naming him is part of the craft too. A nameless, polluted fish is a statistic. Blinky, with a friendly name and a cheerful face, is a character you remember and even root for. Turning a warning about poisoned water into a lovable little mascot is a sly move, because it smuggles the serious point inside something you want to put on a lunchbox. The cuteness is the delivery system for the dread. Underneath the gag sits a sharp observation about the world as it already was in 1990, not the world to come. Nuclear plants were real. Stories about pollution and lax safety and companies cutting corners were already in the news. The show was not guessing at some distant future. It was pointing at a present-day fear and giving it a face people would remember. The joke worked because it was true the day it aired. True about how industry and money and political cover already operated, long before before any real fish ever proved the point. Part of why Blinky endures is how complete the little joke is. The design, the friendly name, the mock serious news framing, and the sharp point about a careless company all arrive together in one tidy image. There is no wasted motion in it. A single cheerful fish carries an entire argument about pollution and power and looking the other way, which is a remarkable amount of meaning to fold into one small gag, the show working at its most efficient. And then, decades later, a real fish proved the point. In 2011, near a nuclear power station in Argentina, someone caught a three-eyed fish, and the photographs went everywhere, set side by side with Blinky. A gentle environmental joke from 1990 had been matched, more than 20 years on, by an actual creature pulled from actual water near an actual plant. The headlines wrote themselves. The cartoon had done it again. But notice what really happened. The show had not seen that specific fish coming. It had simply mocked a danger that was real all along, and reality, given enough years, eventually produced its own version of the joke. The photograph from Argentina did something specific to that old joke. Set beside Blinky, the real fish turned a piece of gentle comedy into something that made people shiver, and the headlines leaned into it hard. From that point on, Blinky became the image everyone reached for whenever a strange, real animal turned up in the news, the cartoon shorthand for nature gone wrong near a smokestack. Real mutations in animals, though, are far more ordinary than they sound. Fish and frogs and other creatures are born with extra or missing parts more often than most people realize, sometimes from pollution and sometimes from plain chance. A three-eyed fish is strange and sad, but it is not proof that a cartoon saw the future. It is proof that the show pointed at a real and ongoing problem, and that the problem, being real, kept producing real examples long after the joke first aired. Hold on that image for a second, because there is something quietly unsettling in it. A cartoon fish, drawn to make people laugh and think in 1990, lifted out of the water in living color in 2011. 3 eyes and all. Nobody planned that. No writer in 1990 pictured a lake in Argentina. And yet there it was, a soft old joke suddenly staring back from a real photograph, looking less like comedy and more like something the show had whispered and the world had answered. That faint chill, the sense that the joke came true, is the exact feeling the whole legend runs on, and the fish is its perfect small example. The same pattern repeats across a handful of other little hits, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a quick cafeteria gag from a 1994 episode about the school principal, in which the lunchroom is revealed to be serving cheap mystery meat, with a sly hint that it is horse parts. The episode aired on April 28, 1994. Nearly 20 years later, in 2013, a real scandal swept across Europe when food sold as beef turned out to contain horse meat. The show had not foreseen that scandal. It had simply made an old, easy joke about cheap food hiding cheap ingredients, a suspicion as old as cafeterias themselves, and the world eventually served up a real version. There is also a small joke about a gadget that cannot read its owner's handwriting. In a 1994 episode set partly around a school bully, a character tries to write the words "beat up Martin" on a handheld electronic device, and the gadget mangles it into "eat up Martha." The episode aired on November 13, 1994. It was a direct jab at a real handheld product of the time that was famous for badly misreading what people wrote. Years later, when phones began correcting our typing into nonsense, people pointed back at that joke as a prediction of autocorrect. But it was never a prediction, it was satire of a real device that already existed in 1994, mocking a frustration people already felt. Each of these little matches followed the very same arc, step for step. A joke airs about some ordinary folly of the present. Years go by, sometimes many of them. The world, being the world, eventually produces a real version of the thing that was mocked, and a headline appears treating the old gag as a crystal ball, ignoring the long, telling gap in between. Once you spot that arc, you can see it coming a mile away, and those gaps in time tell the real story better than any single match does. A genuine forecast would be specific and would land soon, the way a weather report names tomorrow, not some vague guess that pays off 2 decades later. A joke that takes 20 years to come true was never aimed at the future at all. It was aimed at the present, and the future simply wandered into it by chance, the way it eventually wanders into every joke about things that never really change. Even the show's 2007 movie joins the pattern. In one scene, a vast secret government office is shown listening in on ordinary Americans, watching everyone at once. A few years later, in 2013, real revelations about wide-reaching government surveillance filled the news, and the scene was dug up as yet another prediction. Once again, it was nothing of the kind. Concern about the government watching its citizens was already old by 2007. The show had simply drawn a fear that was already in the air, and the years did the rest. Notice that none of these little jokes required any special genius to make. You did not need a science degree to suspect that cheap cafeteria meat might be hiding something, or that a clumsy gadget might mangle your words, or that a power plant might be poisoning a river. These were ordinary suspicions that ordinary people already held. The show simply gave them a sharp, funny shape and put them on screen. Add enough of those tiny, everyday jokes across enough seasons, and a few are bound to match the news eventually. The wonder we feel when they do is real, but the mechanism behind it is as plain as a coin turning up heads a few times across a very long afternoon of flipping. Human folly does not really change. We keep cutting corners, building careless machines, and trusting things we should not trust. So a joke about any of those habits is always, in a sense, waiting to come true. The small hits are not foresight. They are the show noticing the same timeless mistakes we all keep making, over and over. The thread connecting every one of these is the same, and it quietly unravels the magic. Each small hit was a sharp joke about something that already existed at the time it aired. None of them looked forward. All of them looked very closely at the present, mocking a danger or a folly that was already real, and then waited, the way all jokes about real things wait, for the world to catch up and make them look like foresight. What the small hits demonstrate about the legend is that the show was never truly looking into the future at all, only looking very hard at the present, and a sharp enough joke about today has a way of coming true tomorrow on its own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By now, you might think the pattern is unbreakable, that the show really does land these hits again and again. So here is the turn that changes the whole story. The most viral Simpsons predictions of the last several years never happened at all. Section 8. The ones that never happened. A phone lights up in the middle of a national tragedy. Something terrible has just happened in the world. The kind of event that stops everyone cold, and within hours an image is racing across every feed. It is a still from the show, or it looks like one, and it seems to show that the cartoon called this exact disaster years ago. People share it before they think, because it gives them something to feel besides helplessness, a strange little shiver of order in a moment of chaos. And a great many of those images are completely fake. To understand the fakes, you have to start with a real scene that got twisted into one. In an episode from the spring of 1993, the town is struck by a sickness that arrives in a shipment from overseas, called the Osaka flu, and panic spreads until an angry mob accidentally releases a swarm of killer bees. The episode is called Marge in Chains, and it aired on May 6, 1993. It is a comedy about herd panic, about how quickly a frightened town turns into a mob, and the flu is just the spark that sets the silliness in motion. Watch the panic build in that 1993 episode, because the building panic is the actual joke. A package arrives from overseas, someone opens it, one cough becomes two, and within minutes the whole town has worked itself into a frenzy far larger than any real threat. The chaos peaks when a furious crowd topples a truck and accidentally lets loose a swarm of bees, turning a health scare into pure slapstick. The illness was never the point. The point was the stampede of frightened people. Comedy about mass panic only works if the panic feels familiar to the people laughing. We recognize the overreaction because we have lived versions of it. The rush on the stores, the rumor that outruns the facts, the crowd that loses its head. The episode holds a mirror up to that very human habit and lets us laugh at ourselves. It is a joke about us, about how easily fear spreads, not a joke about any particular sickness waiting in the future. The episode was built as satire of how people overreact, and the period details make that obvious. Bill Oakley, the same writer and producer who explained the New York brochure, has said plainly that the Osaka flu story was based on a real outbreak from decades earlier, the Hong Kong flu of the late 1960s. The writers were not gazing into the future. They were looking back at a real piece of history and using it to poke fun at the way fear travels faster than any actual disease. The joke was about human nature, which does not change, not about any specific illness to come. Period details lock that joke firmly into its own moment in time. The styling, the references, the whole texture of the episode belong to the early 1990s, and the outbreak it borrows from belongs to decades before that. Nothing in it points forward. It is a story stitched together from the past and the present of 1993, built to mock a timeless human habit, not to forecast a specific event still many years away. A real attempt to predict a pandemic would look nothing like this gentle farce. It would need a specific disease, a specific time, a specific place, the kind of detail no comedy about a panicking town ever bothers with. What the episode actually offers is an old flu and a runaway mob, which is to say a joke about people, not a map of the future. Then a global pandemic arrived, and the legend went to work. A clip from that 1993 episode began circulating with a new label, presented as proof that the show had predicted the modern outbreak. Sometimes the clip was paired with doctored images, including a faked news caption invented to make the match look exact. The real scene, a gentle satire of panic based on a flu from the 1960s, was quietly rewritten by the internet into a prophecy it never was. The show had made a joke about fear. The fakers made it look like a calendar. Notice how cleanly the relabeling works once someone decides to do it. The footage never changes. The same scene that was a joke about a panicking town in 1993 1993 simply gets a new caption slapped beneath it, and suddenly it is being passed around as a forecast. No animation skill is required, no special access, nothing but a confident lie and a willing crowd. The ease of it is exactly why there are now so many. That is where the legend stops describing the show and starts inventing for it, and the examples pile up fast. When a beloved basketball star died suddenly in 2020, a clip spread claiming the cartoon had foreseen it. The clip was not even from the show, it came from a completely different animated program, a series called Legends of Chamberlain Heights, and the fact-checking team at the French news service France 24 traced it back to its real source. Millions of grieving people shared a prediction that the show never made, attached to a tragedy it never touched, simply because a yellow cartoon style made the lie feel believable. Slow down on how these images are actually manufactured, because the method is simple and quick. Sometimes a real frame is pulled from an episode and given a brand new caption that points it at the day's tragedy. Sometimes a clip from a completely different cartoon is passed off as the show because most people never check the source. Sometimes a detail is simply painted into an old scene that never contained it. The work is crude, but it does not need to be good. It only needs to look right for the half second before someone hits the share button and moves on to the next thing in the feed. Timing is the cruelest part of the whole method. These fakes are dropped into the first frantic hours after something terrible happens, the exact moment when emotion runs highest and patience for fact-checking runs lowest. People are frightened and reaching for meaning, and a familiar cartoon claiming to have known feels like a strange kind of comfort. By the time anyone debunks it, the lie has already traveled around the world, and the quiet correction reaches only a fraction of the eyes that saw the original. The pattern keeps going, each fake a little bolder than the last. After the storming of the United States Capitol in early 2021, an image went around showing the show's grumpy school groundskeeper, Willie, supposedly predicting the riot years before. The fact-checking site PolitiFact looked into it on January 8, 2021, and found the image had been edited. The scene was real, but the details had been altered to match the news. When a historic cathedral in Paris caught fire, another doctored image appeared, claiming the show had drawn the blaze in advance. It had not. The picture had been faked from an old scene that contained no fire at all. Pull back and study what all of these fakes have in common, because the shared trick is the whole point. Every one of them borrows the show's instantly familiar look to smuggle a lie past your judgment. We trust that yellow style. We have grown up with it. So when an image arrives wearing that skin, claiming the cartoon knew, a part of us believes it before we have checked a single fact. The fakers are not really exploiting the show. They are exploiting our affection for it and our hunger to believe that someone saw the chaos coming. Each fresh fake also tends to arrive a little more polished than the last. As the tools to edit images and captions get easier to use, the forgeries get smoother and harder to catch at a glance. What once took obvious clumsy tampering can now be done quickly and cleanly, which means the next wave of fakes will be even more convincing than the ones already fooling people today, and the audience keeps quietly rewarding the effort. Every share, every gasp, every breathless repost tells the fakers that the work pays off, that a cartoon image attached to a tragedy will always find a crowd. The reward is attention, and attention is exactly what keeps the forgeries coming, in a loop that has very little to do with the show and everything to do with us. This is the strange place the legend has finally arrived at. It no longer needs the writers, or the animators, or any actual episode. It has grown large enough and trusted enough to generate its own prophecies out of thin air, stitching the show's face onto whatever the latest disaster happens to be. The real predictions, the genuine ones and the lucky ones alike, are now badly outnumbered by inventions, and the inventions travel faster because they are built for speed, designed to be shared in the heat of a terrible moment before anyone stops to think. Fact-checkers now treat the show almost like a permanent assignment. Reputable outlets keep running collections of these fake predictions because a new one appears with nearly every major news event, as reliable as the news itself. A whole small corner of the fact-checking world exists just to keep up with prophecies the cartoon never made. That alone tells you how completely the legend has slipped free of the show. There is a real cost to all of this that goes well beyond simple confusion. Every convincing fake teaches people to trust a screenshot a little more and to check a little less. It trains a reflex to believe first and verify never, which is dangerous far past the harmless fun of a cartoon, and it buries the genuinely interesting truth, the real hits and the clever craft behind them, under a noisy heap of inventions that are far easier to share than to disprove. The genuine story of how a handful of these predictions really came about is stranger and more interesting than any forgery, and it is the part most people never hear, because a careful truth can never travel as fast as a confident lie. Picture the shape of it from the other side, from the point of view of someone scrolling in grief. An awful thing has happened. You feel small and frightened and powerless, and then a familiar cartoon image slides into view, promising that all of this was somehow known, somehow written, somehow part of a pattern. There is a cruel comfort in that, a sense that the world is not pure chaos after all. So you share it in good good faith, wanting others to feel that same flicker of order. And in doing so, you pass along a lie, built by someone who quietly altered a frame from a cartoon to make a tragedy travel a little faster. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. After all those fakes, it is worth ending on one prediction that was painfully, undeniably real. A bright stage, a white tiger, and a warning the show made a full 10 years too early. Section 9. The one that came truest under the hot lights of a cartoon casino stage. Two performers in matching costumes stride out with a magnificent white tiger between them. They are a glittering Las Vegas magic act. All capes and confidence and showmanship, the kind of duo that turns a dangerous animal into a dazzling spectacle for a room full of tourists. And then, in the middle of their grand performance, the tiger turns on them. The act that was built on controlling a wild creature collapses in an instant, the danger that was always there finally breaking loose in front of a horrified crowd. The scene comes from an episode about Springfield legalizing gambling, which aired on December 16, 1993, in the show's 5th season. It was written by Bill Oakley and his longtime writing partner Josh Weinstein. The two performers, named Gunter and Ernst, are an unmistakable parody of a real and hugely famous Las Vegas act that performed with white tigers for years, an act so famous that nearly everyone in the audience would have recognized it at once. The cartoon was not inventing something strange, it was gently mocking something that already drew enormous crowds, a glamorous show built on the quiet assumption that a wild animal could be trusted to behave forever. Watch how the cartoon sets the act up before anything goes wrong. The two performers stride out in full showbiz glory, the crowd delighted, the tiger gleaming under the lights, everything polished and proud and exactly as a Las Vegas spectacle is supposed to look. The show takes its time letting the glamour build, so that the audience settles into the same comfortable trust the real crowds always felt. Only then does it pull the rug out. Parody this precise carries its own kind of risk. The duo on screen are so clearly modeled on a specific, hugely famous real act that everyone watching knew exactly who was being teased. There is an affection in it, but also a needle, a gentle suggestion that the whole glittering enterprise was built on a quiet gamble. To name your target that plainly, even in fun, is a bolder move than a vaguer joke would have been. The staging of the joke is what gives it its edge. The whole scene gleams with showbiz polish, the bright costumes, the adoring crowd, the practiced smiles, and then the violence arrives suddenly and cuts straight through all of it. The humor lives in the gap between the glittering surface and the wild danger underneath. The idea that this kind of act is one bad moment away from disaster at all times. The cartoon plays it for laughs, but the laugh has a nervous edge, because somewhere in the audience, everyone already half knew that a real animal is never truly tamed. Comedy like this works by saying out loud the thing everyone is quietly thinking. The danger of the real act was an open secret, the kind of risk crowds chose not to dwell on while they enjoyed the spectacle. By turning that buried worry into a punchline, the show gave voice to the unease in the room, the small, nervous thought that sat underneath all the wonder. Audiences laughed precisely because, on some level, they already knew. The joke did not teach them anything new. It simply named a fear they had agreed to ignore, and there is a particular kind of laughter that comes from hearing someone finally say the dangerous thing aloud. That recognition is what made the gag land in 1993, and it is also what made it so hard to laugh at later. What the joke really understood was a danger that was obvious to anyone who thought about it for more than a second. You cannot build a nightly show around a powerful wild predator and expect the odds to stay in your favor forever. The writers were not peering into the future. They were stating something close to common sense, dressed up as a gag. The scene felt less like a prediction and more like a quiet acknowledgement of a risk that everyone watching the real act had chosen not to think about too hard. A wild animal is never truly a partner in an act like that. It is a risk in a beautiful costume, an enormous predator asked to behave night after night against everything its nature tells it. Every performance is a quiet bet that today will not be the day the bet goes wrong. The cartoon did not need to see the future to make its joke. It only needed to say the obvious thing that the bright lights were designed to make everyone forget, and to say it a full 10 years before the world proved it true. Then, 10 years later, the quiet warning came true in the most painful way. On October 3, 2003, during a live performance at a Las Vegas resort, one of the real performers, Roy Horn, was attacked on stage by one of his own white tigers, an animal named Montecore. He was badly hurt. He survived, but the injuries were severe, and he spent years slowly relearning how to walk and how to speak. The act that had run for decades ended that night. He eventually retired, and he died years later, in 2020, his life permanently changed by those few seconds on stage. The real attack stunned a public that had grown up on the act. For decades, the show had been a fixture, a symbol of Las Vegas itself, beloved by millions who never imagined it could end the way it did. When the news broke that one of the performers had been gravely hurt by one of his own tigers, the disbelief was its own kind of grief. A spectacle that had felt safe and magical for a generation situation was suddenly, undeniably, as dangerous as it had always quietly been. For years afterward, almost no one could watch the old cartoon scene the same way again. A gag that had once been a quick, silly aside now carried the shadow of a real man's suffering. The show that had joked about it found itself in an uncomfortable position, holding a punchline that history had turned into something far heavier than comedy. The laugh simply drained out of it, and what was left was a strange, sober kind of accuracy nobody had wanted. Let that real man stay in focus for a moment, because he is not a punchline, and the catalog gets quiet here for a reason. Roy Horn was a performer who had spent his whole life building something beautiful and strange, a show that brought wonder to millions of people. And in a single instant, the very thing his life was built around turned on him and nearly killed him, and then asked him to spend his remaining years learning to do again what the rest of us take for granted. The cartoon had joked about exactly this kind of moment a decade earlier. After it actually happened, to a real person, the joke was not funny anymore. It could not be. It had crossed over from comedy into something that demanded to be treated with care. Some jokes age into something their makers never meant them to be. A line written purely for a laugh can, years later, find itself standing next to a real event that drains every bit of humor out of it. The words on the page do not change. The world changes around them, and a harmless gag becomes a thing you handle gently, almost apologetically. Few examples show that turn as starkly as this one does. A quick aside about a glittering act gone wrong became, a decade on, an unwilling echo of a real catastrophe in a real person's life. The distance between the joke and the reality collapsed completely, and what had been throwaway comedy was left carrying a weight it was never built to hold. The people who made the episode understood the weight of it afterward. In their later commentary on the season, the writers acknowledged what they had done, not as proud prophets, but almost as people who had stated the obvious, and watched it come terribly true. They had seen, like everyone else, that an act like that carried a danger nobody wanted to name out loud. Making a joke of it in 1993 was easy. Watching the real version arrive in 2003 was something else entirely, and it changed how that old gag would be remembered forever. This is why this one stands apart from all the others in the catalog, and why it belongs near the end. It is the entry that came truest, the gag that matched reality most completely, a specific parody of a specific act that suffered a specific disaster 10 years on. And yet, even here, the explanation is the same as it has been all along. The show did not see the future. It named a danger that was already plainly there, hiding under the bright lights, and time did the cruel work of proving the point. The truest prediction in the whole story turns out to rest on the same quiet foundation as the smallest one. Think about what really separates a warning from a prophecy. A prophecy claims to see a specific future that no reasonable person could have known. A warning just names a danger that is already sitting in plain sight, waiting. The cartoon did the second thing. It looked at a glamorous act built on a wild animal and said, out loud and for a laugh, that this could go terribly wrong, which is something a great many people already feared and chose not to say. And notice that the realest prediction in the whole catalog is also the saddest one in it. Everywhere else, the hits are fun, a president, a merger, a gadget, a fish, things you can marvel at with a grin. Here, the marveling stops, because a real person paid for it with years of his life. The truest entry is the one that asks you not to celebrate at all, only to sit quietly with how a joke about an obvious risk became a man slowly, painfully learning to walk and to speak again. So picture the stage one last time, but picture it after. The lights are down now, the act long over, the crowd's gone home. Somewhere there is an old cartoon frame of two performers and a turning tiger, drawn for a laugh in 1993, and somewhere else there is a real man who lived the thing the cartoon only joked about, and who carried it with him for the rest of his life. Between those two images sits everything this story has been trying to say, that a joke about a real danger is not magic, and that sometimes the world makes it come true in ways no one would ever have wished for, least of all the people who first drew it as nothing more than a quick joke. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So which of these were genuine, which were only luck, and which were never true at all? When you finally set every one of them beside each other, a single quiet pattern explains very nearly everything. Section 10. The pattern behind all of them. So line them all up, the true ones and the false ones side by side, and the noise starts to settle into something you can actually read. A president named in a throwaway line, a sign on a studio gate, a gadget on a wrist, an equation on a chalkboard, a brochure, a fish, a tiger, and a long parade of fakes that were never in any episode at all. It looks, at first, like chaos, hundreds of guesses scattered across decades, but underneath all of it run just three plain forces, and once you see them, the whole legend stops being magic and starts being something far more interesting. Before naming the forces, sit for a moment with how strange the whole situation really is. A cartoon family invented to make people laugh has somehow become a kind of folk oracle, a thing people genuinely half consult when the world frightens them. No one set out to build that. It grew on its own, slowly, out of decades of jokes and the peculiar way memory and the internet treat a show that simply refuses to end. That is a remarkable thing to have happened by accident. None of it was ever designed. Nobody in that writer's room ever sat down meaning to build a profit, and the show has spent years politely insisting it is nothing of the kind. What looks from the outside like a plan was really just three ordinary things piling up together over a very long time, until the pile started to look like something supernatural. Pull the pile apart, and the magic turns back into its plain parts. The first force is simply the math of a very long run. A show that makes that many episodes, stuffed with that many jokes, over that many years, is going to land a few accidental bullseyes no matter what. It cannot help it. Most of those guesses miss and vanish, forgotten by the next week, and nobody keeps a list of the misses. Only the hits survive in memory, which fools us into thinking the show is far more accurate than it ever was. We are looking at the winners and quietly forgetting the enormous pile of losers underneath them. Volume alone is a stranger explanation than it first sounds. We are not talking about a few dozen guesses. We are talking about an ocean of them, tossed out across decades, in the background of nearly every scene the show has ever made. With a pool that enormous, a handful of accidental matches is not surprising at all. It would be far more surprising if a show that size had never once stumbled into a coincidence worth a headline. We keep a careful scrapbook of the hits and quietly burn the record of the misses. Every match that lands gets saved, shared, and celebrated, while the countless guesses that went nowhere vanish without a trace. That lopsided memory is what fools us. We are judging the show by its highlight reel and forgetting that the highlight reel was cut from thousands of hours of ordinary, forgettable jokes. The second force is the one that actually deserves respect, and it is the reason you cannot wave the whole thing away as luck. The room that made this show was genuinely brilliant, packed with people who understood science and history and the way the world really works. When they hid a real piece of physics behind a cartoon character, or extended a business trend to its logical end, or named a danger everyone else was ignoring, that was not chance. That was intelligence, doing quietly on purpose what the legend later mistook for prophecy. A handful of these so-called predictions were really just very smart people seeing the present clearly and following it one honest step forward. Sit with that second force a little longer, because it is the one people are quickest to forget. In the rush to debunk the legend, it is tempting to wave the whole thing away as luck and fakery and nothing more, but that would erase something real. A few of these moments truly were the work of unusually clever people putting genuine knowledge into a cartoon on purpose, and that deserves to be remembered, not flattened into the same pile as the forgeries. Granting all of that, the third force is where the story turns genuinely uneasy, because the moment a legend grows large enough, it stops needing any truth at all to keep spreading. It runs on belief, on appetite, on the simple fact that people will nearly always rather share a thrilling lie than stop to check a dull and complicated fact, and no amount of clever craft in the show's past can slow that engine down. The third force is the strangest, and it is the one running the show now. The legend has grown so large that it no longer needs the cartoon. It generates its own prophecies, builds its own fakes, and spreads them faster than any correction can chase. Every new disaster sets off the same hunt, and if no real scene fits, someone will simply manufacture one, because the appetite is bottomless, and the familiar yellow style makes almost any lie go down easy. The myth has become a machine that feeds itself, and it will keep running long after anyone remembers which predictions were ever real. Hold the three forces next to one another and notice how neatly they divide the work between them. The sheer volume explains the great mass of accidental hits, the lucky matches nobody planned. The brilliance of the room explains the small handful of deliberate ones, the jokes that were smart on purpose and held up for years. And the self-feeding myth explains all the rest, the fakes and the misreadings that the show had no hand in at all. Between the three of them, there is almost nothing left to call mysterious. What none of those three forces is, anywhere, is magic. Not one of them requires the show to have seen a single thing that an attentive, clever person could not have reasoned toward on their own. Luck, intelligence, and our own hunger to believe are enough to account for every entry in the entire catalog, the famous ones and the forgotten ones alike. And that, oddly enough, makes the show more impressive rather than less. Being secretly psychic would be a cheap trick, a gift that asks nothing of anyone. Being smart, being prolific, and being loved enough that the world writes legends in your name, that is a far harder and far rarer thing to be. The plain explanation is the more flattering one. Put those three forces together, and the honest answer to the whole question finally comes into view. Did the show predict the future? No. Not in the way the headlines mean, not with any power to see what was coming. What it did was simpler, and, in its own way, more impressive. It threw out an enormous number of guesses, a few of which luck rewarded. It employed brilliant people who occasionally encoded real truth into a joke on purpose. And it became so beloved that the world started writing prophecies in its name, long after the writers had any say in the matter. Why does any of this matter, in the end, beyond settling a fun argument? Because how we read a coincidence is really how we read the whole world. The same same habit that turns a cartoon brochure into a prophecy is the habit that lets a doctored screenshot decide what millions of people believe in the middle of a crisis. Learning to pause on the difference is not just trivia. It is a small piece of how to think clearly in a noisy time. Learning to sort the real from the invented is a modest skill with a surprisingly large use. It is the same muscle whether you are weighing a cartoon prediction or a breaking news rumor or a too-perfect story that lands in your feed. Practice it on something as low stakes as a yellow family, and you sharpen it for everything heavier that comes after. There is something almost touching in why we keep the legend alive anyway, even after the trick is explained. We want the cartoon to be wiser than we are. We want to believe that somewhere, somehow, the chaos of the world was written down in advance by someone gentle and funny who understood it all. A show that seems to know the future is a small comfort against a future that feels impossible to predict. So we keep sharing the headlines, keep freezing the frames, keep hoping the next one turns out to be real, because the hope itself feels good, and because the alternative, that nobody is steering and nothing is foretold, is harder to sit with. Consider how the legend will behave from here, because its path is easy to predict. Every future disaster, every shock, every strange turn in the news will set off the same hunt through old episodes, and when no real scene fits, someone will simply build one. The fakes will keep coming, faster and more convincing, long after everyone has forgotten which predictions were ever genuine. The machine does not need the show anymore. It only needs our willingness to believe. Spare a thought, too, for the genuine ones in all that noise. The real hits, the clever equation, and the sharp reading of an industry and the rest are now badly outnumbered by inventions, and the inventions travel faster because they are built for speed. The honest, interesting truth about this show is quietly drowning under a flood of prophecies it never made, which may be the strangest fate of all for a series that was, at its best, genuinely smart. So the next time one of these headlines slides past you, you will know how to read it. Ask which of the three it is. A lucky dart thrown across a very long run, a clever person seeing the present clearly, or a fake built for a frightened moment and dressed in a familiar yellow skin. Almost everyone will fall into one of those three, and almost none will be what the headline wants you to believe. And the show, for its part, simply keeps going. Somewhere tonight, on some channel or some screen, an old episode is playing to people who half believe the cartoon can see what is coming. New episodes are still being written. The guesses are still being tossed out, week after week, year after year, into a world that will eventually match a few of them and call it a miracle. The legend has outgrown the show that started it, and it will keep growing on its own. A story we tell ourselves about a yellow family who never once saw the future, and never needed to end up looking like they did. That may be the only real prediction the show ever made. Not about any election or merger or disaster, but about us. About how badly we would want to believe, and how easily we would always find a way. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.